The absolute basics of the Wesleyan way. Who was John Wesley? And what was the young Wesley like? John Wesley knew his life had a purpose. He just didn't always know what that purpose was. In 1709, when John was 5 years old, the Wesley family's home caught fire while they slept. His parents, Samuel and Susanna, managed to get John's siblings out of the house, but John was trapped on the second floor. As the house weakened, a neighbor, standing on the shoulders of other men, pulled John from the window before the roof collapsed. When John talked about his rescue from the fire, he liked to say he was a brand plucked from the burning. Just as God brought Israel out of Egypt, he provided John a way out of the burning house. Like Israel, John was saved for something. Also like Israel, John didn't know his full purpose just yet. John grew up well. He was a good son, a good brother, and a good student. In 1720, John went to college at one of the best universities in the world, Oxford. At Oxford, he approached both his studies and his religion very methodically. John's mother, Susanna, taught him the importance of method. Anytime you learn something new, you use a method. A method is an orderly series of steps you take to gain something. The scientific method is an orderly series of steps you take to gain scientific knowledge. Let's say you want to learn to speak French. You could go to the library and pick a random French book off the shelf, watch a few French films, read a few pages here and there in a French dictionary, and so on. Maybe, if you continue doing random Frenchish things for long enough, you would gain some knowledge of the French language, but you wouldn't have your method to thank for it. You would learn in spite of your method. Now imagine you began by enrolling in an introductory French course, and you kept records to ensure you spent at least an hour every day working through your introductory French book, never moving ahead until you had mastered the prior content. And then, after a couple of years of study, you moved to Paris for 6 months. In this case, chances are good that you would learn to speak French. Why? Because you had a good method. John was obsessed with having a good method. He believed in the power of method. As a student, this meant the careful study of math, history, languages, and so on. As a Christian, this meant the careful study of his soul. At Oxford, John and his brother Charles gathered a group of Christians interested in methodical care of their souls. But this seemed strange to others at the university. Many began noticing with some alarm what seemed to them to be fanatical practices of fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, annoying habits such as getting up at 4 and 5 in the morning, and the seemingly radical extent to which Wesley and his friends carried their frugality and their various methods of self-denial. While classmates were enjoying themselves, John and his friends were reading their Bibles and denying themselves. They were seeking to become holy. John, Charles, and their friends were so committed to the methodical approach to faith that they earned several nicknames at Oxford. Some called them Bible moths, while others called them the Holy Club. There was another name that people called John's group. They meant it as an insult, but John adopted it as a badge of honor: the Methodists. The Wesley brothers' methodical faith led them to travel to Georgia as missionaries. As their voyage began in 1735, John kept up his methodical pursuit of the faith. At sea, he settled for a simple diet of rice and bread. Each day he spent an hour in private prayer, an hour in public prayer, and 2 hours in the study of Scripture, all before 9 a.m. In all likelihood, Wesley took his faith more seriously than you or I. Despite all this, there was still something missing. His methods weren't enough. In the 1700s, it took several months to sail across the Atlantic Ocean from England to America. In late 1736, while still at sea, the weather turned bad. Several storms threatened the Wesley ships, the Simmons. Each time, John was terrified. Instead of trusting in God, he was terrified at the possibility of his own death. Jesus Christ slept while the storm raged, but John Wesley trembled in fear. The worst storm kicked up on January 25th, during a worship service on board the Simmons. While Wesley and the English passengers trembled, the Germans on board the ship sang hymns. Wesley wrote, "The sea broke over, split the mainsail in pieces, covered the ship, and poured in between the decks, as if the great deep had already swallowed us up. A terrible screaming began among the English. The Germans calmly sang on. I asked one of them afterward, 'Were you not afraid?' He answered, 'I thank God, no.' I asked, 'But were your women and children not afraid?' He replied mildly, 'No, our women and our children are not afraid to die.'" John was so moved by the example of the German Christians that he questioned how real his own faith was. If his faith cannot stand in the face of the ultimate test, death, what sort of faith was it? In early February, the Wesleys arrived in Georgia. John became the Anglican priest in Savannah. However, John's ministry in Georgia did not meet his expectations. He had hoped to bring the gospel to indigenous peoples, but when the task became difficult, he gave up. Worst of all was the ordeal with Sophia Hopke. One of John Wesley's responsibilities as an Anglican priest was to oversee communion in his church. Not only did he lead the communion service, but he also ensured that only people who were properly prepared received the bread and wine. Unsurprisingly, John developed a method for this responsibility. Those who prepared themselves by prayer, fasting, and confession of sin were allowed to receive communion. He even scheduled time every Saturday for people to come for prayer and confession to make sure they were ready. These rules were not entirely unusual for Wesley's day. What really got him in trouble was how strict he could be in deciding who had properly confessed their sins. John developed a close friendship with a young woman in Savannah named Sophia Hopke. He served as her tutor in the faith and in French. Over time they fell in love, but John was troubled and indecisive. At moments he was warm with Sophia, and at other moments very cold. Over time, likely from frustration, Sophia decided to marry another man. Wesley was heartbroken. As a result of the marriage, Sophia stopped attending communion as regularly. She ceased to go to the Saturday night meetings for confession of sins. John became concerned Sophia was not properly prepared to receive communion. One Sunday in August 1737, Wesley refused to give Sophia the bread and wine. Sophia was humiliated. In 18th century Georgia, priests who performed their job improperly could be taken to court. Sophia's guardian, a powerful leader in Savannah, charged John with several crimes. Feeling weak and defeated, John abandoned Savannah and set sail back to England. On his way home, John cataloged his weaknesses in his journal. He lacked faith. He was filled with pride. He still feared death. He was lazy. He often spoke harshly. Despite the carefulness of his methods, Wesley thought himself a failure. John Wesley knew his life had a purpose. He just didn't always know what it was. Whatever that purpose was, he didn't find it in Georgia. In the next lesson, we'll talk about the moment that warmed Wesley's heart and changed the direction of his life.